Yeah, acting stupid. So I'm gonna send out the link for that. Just gonna be a simple link through. Okay. So there's going to be two different types of inferences. Okay. So let's first start off with what an inference is. Because then once we know what these two things are, then we're going to talk about the video and what we can infer from the video. Okay. So the first thing that's important for us to understand is what an inference is. Okay. So an inference is an educated guess, right? Excuse me. Educated guess. There's two types. So the first one that you're almost never going to see on the test, but it will be there, even if it's rare, is going to be an explicit inference, right? Now, anytime we're inferring, like anytime we're trying to take a guess at what's going on, there's a couple of things that we use. The very first thing that we use is our background knowledge, your life experience, right? And when we're testing, we also use clues from the story. So clues from the story plus our own background knowledge, that's how we can take an educated guess. So when we're talking about an explicit inference, then we're going to make an educated guess that is going to be relying more on the text, less on our background knowledge. Our background knowledge is called schema. So if you hear me say the word schema, that's teacher talk for what you know from before, right? And then what you get from the text, we call those text clues, right? So explicit means that what you read, what you saw, is pretty much telling you exactly what happens. So it's like if you're watching an action movie and then like James Bond, whoever Jason Bourne, they have a gun and they're pointing it at the bad guy, and the next thing you see is like blood on the wall. Well, they don't have to necessarily tell us that the bad guy was shot, but because of what I see, because of what I read, I can infer without having too much background knowledge that that guy probably passed away. Right? Even if I've never held a gun before, even if I don't know exactly why that guy is bad, I can infer that by piecing everything together. Right? So that's going to be relying more on text clues. You don't necessarily have to have a lot of background knowledge. Okay? You're going to see a little bit of this. And you also saw a little bit of this in the video, right? Where they're pretty much telling you what's going on. You don't have to have a lot of background knowledge. It's almost obvious. That's why it's called explicit. So I know that those of you that are here probably have kids. And anytime you're watching a TV show, something like that, and it says explicit content, that means if there's a scene that has violence or sexual content, they're going to pretty much show it, right? It's not going to be like where they show a lamp or the window when something violent or sexual is going on, right? They're being explicit. It's right in your face. They're telling you with those text clues exactly what's happening, right? They're not going to rely on your background knowledge. So if you're watching it with a kid, it's going to probably be inappropriate because it's not going to go over their head. They're going to show them, right? That's what an explicit inference is. Questions so far on that?
No question.
Okay. You're not going to, yeah, go ahead. Oh, somebody said they had a question? No? Tripping? Okay.
No question.
Okay. So you're not going to see a lot of that, but you will have a few questions. Now, the idea is that after you read something, we built your background knowledge. The text built your background knowledge. And that's why we have an implicit inference. So an implicit inference is where you need to rely more on your background knowledge, right? and a lot less on what the text is telling you. Right? So what'll happen a lot of times, and this is what makes it really difficult, they're going to give you a few sentences that talk about what it means to like farm. Or in the case of the practice test, they give you a few little examples about a judge and a dead bird, and they just expect you to have the kind of background knowledge that understands that we're talking about a courtroom. Right? They're depending on your schema to help you. They're not depending too much on the text clues, right? So they're going to give you a little bit of text clues, but you're mostly going to rely on your background knowledge. And that's hard, right? So unless you've been to court or you are familiar with the court system for whatever reason, you're not really going to understand what's going on here. And that's probably why the vast majority of us struggled with that. So implicit inferences are going to rely more on your background knowledge. How do we do that in the classroom? This is why I encourage everybody to talk. Normally, we also talk about computer skills. We talk about workplace skills. And some people are like, why do we do that? It's not necessarily on the test. Well, it is. Because if we can build your background knowledge on several different things, you take that with you for the test. So you'll understand how a courtroom works and things like that, which our courtrooms are very unique. Our legal system is very unique. So that's why we do those things. That's why I'm always encouraging everybody to talk and ask questions so you can build your background knowledge. I can't give you all the background knowledge in the world. And I've noticed that the test has started to ask questions about things that you probably have experienced. If they give you a graph and that graph and what you read is something you have no background knowledge on, then you need to spend a lot of time breaking that information down because they're going to ask you to infer. And again, you're not going to get a lot of help from the text necessarily. It's going to come down to your background knowledge. So sometimes as you're reading, you're going back to what you knew from before. You're going back to that, your schema, and you're trying to build that up based off what you're reading. This will be the majority of your questions. And this exists for both fiction and nonfiction, literature, informational. Questions on that? Questions.
No, no question.
Okay. So,
No question.
good. Okay. So if we go back to the video, I'm going to pull it up again. If we go back to the video, what can we infer as soon as the video started playing? What can we infer and what type of inference? Go ahead.
Boy stole.
How do you know he stole?
Because the lady was yelling at him and pulled out the stuff from his pocket.
And where is this where is this taking place? Is he stealing from like a classroom? Is he stealing from a gang?
I think it was a pharmacy because he stole medicine.
Oh, okay. So he has to be in some kind of a pharmacy, a place where people can buy food. And what makes you think that? Like, what kind of inference are we here?
Because the man asked him if his mom was sick.
Okay, good. And what else? What else lets us know this is like a market? What kind of inferencing?
The little boy was stolen something, but it's not. It's just a poor boy.
Oh, how do you know he's poor?
A doctor.
How do you know he's poor? Because how can you? What kind of inference did you make to know that he's poor? Was it explicit or implicit?
For the medicine. The man paid for what he stole to the lady.
So how do we know he's not stealing the medicine to join a gang or something?
Because the guy asked him if his mom was sick. So we assume that he stole medicine for his mother.
Okay.
This is a little doctor for early years.
Okay. Now, do you guys think you were making an implicit inference based off your own background knowledge, or was it explicit, mostly from what the story was telling you?
Explicit.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious, right? Yeah, it's pretty obvious. Like, you see her getting mad at him. The camera shows that it's some kind of medicine, right? And is the boy a hardcore criminal? Is this kid a gangster and he just wants to steal and run the streets?
No,
How do you know that?
because he stole medicine for his mom.
Well, there's something else about the boy himself that shows that this isn't like who he is on an everyday basis, right? Because people can say, I'm poor, so I need to steal, I need to sell crack, I need to do all these illegal things that have no money. But is that who this boy is? And if it's not who the boy is, how do you know that? If you watch the video, look at the boy.
The way he's dressed.
Yeah. And what is he doing the whole time?
I gotta watch him.
A shy boy is not an aggressive boy.
Say it again.
If a shy boy is not an aggressive boy.
Okay. So you think he's looking at you think he's looking down because he's shy? Or why do you think he's looking down?
He's embarrassed.
He's embarrassed.
Yes, he's embarrassed.
Right? So he's not happy. He's not prideful. He's not like, hey, I'm trying to get mines. In fact, is he looking at anybody even in the eyes?
No.
No. The entire time that he's in the scene, what is he looking at?
Brown.
The ground, right? So as we're reading and we're testing, all of those things, because obviously this is a fake story, all of those things are important. Anytime an author writes those things down, you have to analyze it, right? This is teaching us to think critically. If he's looking at the ground, this guy is not a gangster. He's not like doing a bunch of illegal things to help out his mom. Right? In fact, he's just stealing the medicine and he's embarrassed. He feels shame. How do I know that? Because according to the text or according to this scene, he's looking at the ground the whole time. Right? He's not trying to run away. He's not screaming at the people. He feels shame. So obviously, this is not something for him that is normal. We have to be able to do this when we read. We have to be able to infer based off the little bit of information they give us and our own background knowledge. So this video is very similar to what you would see on the test because the idea would be that as an adult, which most people who take this test would probably be adults, that you know someone who has stolen, you know what shame is. That's fair game. We're not talking about like golf or making sweaters or something that no one's ever done before or doesn't really like. This is pretty universal. Let's continue on with the video before we go to the practice questions. Okay. Now, when you see the man talking to the boy, and I know you've already seen this, can we make a prediction that the man's going to pay? Can we infer that the man is going to pay? And if you can infer the man is going to pay, how do you know that? Can we predict that the man was going to pay?
I couldn't.
Okay. Did anybody predict that the man was going to pay?
Yes, because he asked why or for who the medicine.
Yeah. Right? There you go. So why would he ask who the medicine was for? Right? Go ahead, Andre.
I think this is a grateful action, because because the old man helping him when he was a kid with this problem with his mom, and the old man. That you remember that old man and get a grateful.
You're exactly right. He became
Yeah,
grateful,
yeah.
right? And he helped him out. And then that kid ended up becoming a doctor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. When he becomes a doctor. Yeah.
So you could almost predict that not only is this guy going to come and help, but as we're reading and we know, and we're going to talk about this a lot more as well, although nobody seemed to struggle with the plot elements, we're going to talk about this. We know that fiction stories have to follow a pattern. And I'm going to talk about that here quickly. So because we know that they have to follow a pattern, it would make sense for that to happen because the man is being kind to the boy, right? And also we know that all fiction stories have to have a theme, right? All fiction stories have to have a theme. And what does the word theme mean? Theme.
A lesson.
A lesson. And what lesson does the story teach us?
No.
What lesson does the story teach us?
Oh, if you give someone, then you will get back.
Yeah. Those who give shall receive, right? We should be kind to others, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to do a quick little mini lesson here. This is going to help you with fiction. All fiction stories have to follow this. They all have to start out with what is known as an exposition. An exposition, this is where the setting of the story comes into play and we meet the characters. All fiction stories in America, at least, have to follow this. If you go to like Japan, I know they don't follow this. In France, if you watch any of their movies, which I think would be the easiest thing to think about since it's not in the same language, they don't follow any of this, right? They treat movies as art and it's like meant to be beautiful and they don't follow like a particular story. So all of them have to have an exposition. All stories have to have a rising action. And I'm telling you this so that it's easier for you to predict and infer because you know where the story has to go. The rising action is where we're going to be introduced to the problem of the story. All right, and let's see if you recall. This is mostly going to be for Ildi since I know that I've gone over this before. Do you remember, Ildi, what the 4 types of conflict in stories are?
Oh. Yourself against nature.
Yes. So what kind of conflicts do we have? We have man versus self, man versus nature,
This was society.
man versus society, and there's one more.
Self, nature, society, and
Man versus man.
oh
Right?
yeah.
Yeah. And in this story, who can we infer or like what can we infer the problem is, the conflict? Is it man versus self, man versus nature, man versus society, or man versus man?
I think it was man versus society because the boy was poor. That's what made him have to steal.
So now that we understand the way stories are told, then we know where things have to go. It's easier to infer. And I agree with you. I would say this is man versus society, right? So we have the exposition, the rising action, and then we get to the climax. Okay. And the climax is where the main character is going to come face to face with the problem. Okay? The character comes face to face with the problem. And that's pretty much where we stopped on the video. Right? And that's when the other person came to help, right? Because they knew that the boy didn't have the money for the medicine, right? He comes from a poor society. After that, we had the resolution. And this is where the problem is fixed. Not that the story's over. In the resolution, the problem is fixed. That's all. And how was the problem fixed here?
The man paid for the medicine.
Yeah, okay, what's going on? Well, I haven't heard from Alma, Mariana, if you're on here. It's definitely worth speaking up.
The initial problem with the boy, the solution was when the man paid for the medicine.
Correct. Now, so I'm sorry. I labeled this incorrectly. This is the falling action. The falling action is where the problem is fixed. The actual end of the story is the resolution. Why is this different? Because in the resolution, everything is wrapped up. The problem is fixed, the main character learns something, and the story ends, right? So all the loose ends are tied up. And the main character normally changes. How did the main character change at the end of the story?
What was the question?
How did the main character change at the end of the story?
He's gonna be the one with money.
Yeah, he learned, right? And then he actually gave money to the guy that helped him when his mom was sick, right? So he became more giving, right? So instead of stealing and stuff like that, he actually helped out somebody else, right? So this is the elements that all fiction stories must follow. So as we're reading and we are inferring, we know that this is what has to happen. Now, when they take out pieces of a story, you have to fill in whatever, you have to fill in the other elements, right? So the story about the bird and the bird that was murdered, where do you think they took, what piece do you think they took out? What piece do you think they took out and gave to you? Did they just give you the exposition? Did they just give you the rising action? Did they just give you the climax, the falling action, the resolution? Obviously, it's not the whole thing because they even said it's a piece, it's an excerpt. What piece did they give you?
That story is still confusing me.
And
I
like,
don't know.
exactly, it's confusing because they didn't give you all of this. They only gave you a piece. So now that you understand the pieces, what did they give you? You understand all these little elements of a story, these plot elements. What did they give you?
I think this makes confusion because this main idea is split in two parts, and that when you watch this video, okay, we have one history at the beginning and another history at the end, but it's great because this both history interacts each other. So when you watch the video, you can expect that the doctor was the kid from the beginning. The
Yes.
It's really great.
Yes.
It's great the way when the begin the video interact with and the end the video.
Correct. So the exposition in the setting, you see the characters and you know that one of the characters is poor and he's trying to do the right thing, and another character helps him. And then at the very end, it's like they switched, right? So that's easy to follow because we know each and every part of the story. What made this last question, 12 through 14, hard is they didn't give you everything. So let's figure out what they did give you. In the story about the bird that was murdered, what did they give you? Did they give you the exposition? Did they tell us what the setting is and who the characters are? Did they introduce them?
I think no.
No, they didn't. All you know is that you have an attorney talking. All you know is you have a lawyer who's talking. We don't know what the setting is. They're not telling us. We have to infer, right? The characters, they're not telling us who the characters are either. All of this we have to infer, right? So let's do that now. What is the exposition? So what is the setting of that story about the bird? Let's write that out. What is the setting? This is something you would do on the test on your own, but we're going to do it together as a family. What is the setting of the story?
Where? In a ship in the ocean?
In the ocean? What do you mean?
It's because I don't know if I understand good, but the boy was in a boat.
Oh no, I mean from the practice test. I was just using the video as an example. We know the video gave us everything, right? So the question is now for the practice test, what did they not give us? And as Andre had mentioned about how in the video this was given to you, the setting, you know, like where the story takes place, you know who the characters are. Well, on the practice test, they didn't give us this. We have to infer it. So the question becomes, what can we infer about the setting? Like in the practice test, where is the story taking place? The story about the bird that was murdered. Where is the story taking place? Excuse me.
John Wright's house.
Okay, so there could be more than one setting. So yeah, definitely a house because the bird lived in a house. Where else is the story taking place? Like who's talking?
Everybody, the neighbors, the attorney. Oh, maybe a courtroom.
There we go. The attorney is talking. So we know that right here, right now, they're in a courtroom. Obviously, because they're talking about a dead bird, it probably has to go back to a house. But right here, right now, we're in a courtroom. Did they tell us we're in a courtroom? Did they tell us they are in a courtroom? Yes or no? Did they tell us that they are in a courtroom?
No, they don't.
Okay, hold on. Okay, hold on. I'm only really hearing from like two people. So I love the fact that Andre's speaking up. I definitely hear from Ildi. I'm not sure what's going on with the rest of my friends.
Okay, I think that in this position, characters, let me know. It's shown us for the kid is a poor people and a poor family and stolen some medicine for his mom.
Yeah, you're exactly right.
Little doctor.
Yes. So all of that was clear. Yeah, all of that was clear, right? All of that was clear in the video. Yeah. So now in the text, when you read the text for questions 12 through 14, it was not clear with the story. Yeah, right? It was not clear, right? They just had people talking. We don't know who the characters are. We don't even know where the story's taking place, which makes it really hard. And in fact, I want to say almost everybody that I looked at for those questions got it wrong. So the question now becomes, how do we infer what those things are? So Ildi mentioned that the story had to have a house in it because it had a bird, and that right now we're in a courtroom. Did they tell us that we were in a courtroom, or how do we know that we're in a courtroom?
Because the attorney is asking the question.
There you go. Because an attorney is asking a question, we have to infer it's in a courtroom. So now we got this part of it, right? We understand that they're in a courtroom and that an attorney is talking. What about the characters? How many characters do we have in this story? And who are the characters?
Lima, Antonin.
You got the attorney, that's one.
Yeah.
Who else? We have Mrs. Hale. We have Miss Peters. Okay. Who else? Is there anybody else?
The sheriff.
You said that, the sheriff?
Yeah, the sheriff.
Okay. Who else? There's one more character that the whole story.
Attorney and Miss Hale, Miss Peters, sheriff.
Who's the murderer?
Oh,
John Wright. So we have 5 characters. And I know this is probably going to seem like hard to do, but that's why we practice it, so we get better at it. So we know the setting is a courtroom and we have 5 characters and they're all very different, right? So now let's look at the rising action, right? What is a problem here? What is a problem in this text?
John Wright Morgan.
Yeah, they killed the bird. That's the problem.
A man was.
Yes. Yes. Is that man versus self, man versus nature, man versus society, or man versus man?
Yeah.
Which problem is it? And you're exactly right. Bird is dead. So what problem are they using in this fictional story?
I think it's man versus society.
Okay.
Man versus man because a person or the.
Yeah, you could really argue probably any one of these, right? I would like to say man versus nature because the man killed the bird, but we know that you could argue pretty much any one of these, right? So we know that's a clear problem. The bird died. You could look at the man now who killed him, John Wright, as fighting society. You could look at it as him fighting the attorney, Any one of these. But we know there's a clear problem. They didn't really give us this either. We don't even know there was a problem with the bird until what, like 3-4 paragraphs in, we start understanding that they're in a court and that there's a bird, right? And then the bird had died. So not only did they not give us the exposition, they didn't really tell us what the rising action was. They're not telling us what the problem is. So we're missing all of these things. So as we read, we need to be filling them in. Like, oh, there's a bird. Oh, the bird died. Oh, that's why they were in court, because the bird was killed. So we're working backwards. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
All right. Now, who is Miss Hale? That's one of the characters, right? Because we're getting to the climax.
Yeah.
We're getting to the point where the main character here, the family that lost a bird, they have to come to terms with the fact that the bird is dead and they think they know who killed it. So who is Miss Hale?
I think she's a neighbor.
Okay, why do you say that?
I don't know.
And that's okay.
Or a family member.
Okay, so what makes you think she's a family member in the story? So, and this is what we do when we read, right? So we're trying to always judge the people that we're reading about. So what makes you feel like she's family and not like the judge or another attorney or somebody else?
Let me know that I understand about this Miss Haley. Miss Haley has bird cage. Someone that's a bird cage. Someone will be someone close to family or.
There we go, Andre. Yes.
Something like this.
Yes. So they don't have to tell us. Remember, we're inferring, right? So they're not telling us straight out these people are family. We have to infer, and it's implicit. So we have to go off of our own background knowledge, right? So given the fact the relationship she has with the birdcage and John Wright, we know that she's either some kind of a family friend or just straight up family, right? And we know that because when we read how they interact.
Okay, perfect.
Does that make sense? So now it's becoming a little clearer, right? We know what's going on in a courtroom. We know that we have attorneys and family members. The bird is dead, and now they're in the courtroom to talk about who killed the bird. So we're at the climax. All right. Now let's go to the falling action, right? So how is this problem being fixed? How is this problem being fixed?
I'm not sure, but when the attorney asks if there was a cat, we can infer that the cat killed the.
Ooh, so okay. So the attorney's trying to say that maybe it was a cat. Okay.
I'm not sure.
No. Yeah, I can see that. So what happens towards the end of the story? Because remember, they're not gonna tell us the falling action and the resolution. They're not gonna straight up tell us how the story ends. We have to infer. We have to go back to our prior knowledge. So based off what we read, what can we predict? What can we infer is probably going to happen?
Can you repeat the question again, please?
What can we infer is happening at the end? What is the falling action, the resolution?
I think this Miss Peters tells us the history when she was a girl and she has a kitten that hurt. That is not clear for me.
Yeah, a lot of this isn't clear.
And
They're not going to give us any. They're not giving us most of this stuff, so we have to go back and piece it together. So we piece together who the characters are. We piece together the setting. We know what the problem is. We know what the climax is. Right? They didn't tell us any of this. We just know it now from reading. So we have to finish the story. Because this is a piece, they didn't give us the end. They just literally finished with people talking. We have to infer the end of the story.
yeah, the infer, I think this because the she loved this bird. She, his wife, killed him. Is this maybe?
Okay, so we can infer by the end of the story that we know who killed the bird.
Yeah.
And who do we believe, according to the story, killed the bird? Let's look at the very last sentence.
Maybe,
go ahead, Andrew.
Maybe John Wright killed the bird.
And
because it's
outstanding. Outstanding.
A lot of bird sing.
Yes, outstanding.
For all his life.
Yeah.
And maybe John Wright killed a bird, and the bird that his wife really loved.
Yes.
And his wife killed him with the rope around his neck while he's just slept. I think this is the end, one of conclusion, but I'm not sure.
You hit the nail right on the head, Andre. You're exactly right. So, based off the fact that John Wright had killed another animal and never had any kids around, and his wife says, if there have been years and years of nothing, then a bird comes to sing to you, it would be awful. Right? So then we know that John Wright didn't like the bird. John Wright had killed the bird, and maybe his wife, Mrs. Hale, or whoever that person was, killed him. Right? Now, they don't tell us the end. all they do is finish the story. They don't tell us if someone's going to go to jail, what happened to the bird, or like what's going to happen after the bird was killed. They don't give us this. That's what makes it hard. So it's important that we know the way a story goes so we can fill in the blanks. And that's what we did together. We're filling in the blanks. Okay. And again, I don't mind if you participate in any language. What I don't like is silence, right? So even if you're confused, tell me what you're confused. You're going to get a lot of questions like this in the story. No, it's not easy. It's not. But that's why we have to talk it out, right? Tell me where you think the story is going to go. Any questions about this? Because I haven't heard anything from Alma, haven't heard anything from Mariana. I've got 2 messages from Diane. So I imagine there are going to be questions. Or if you're confused, speak up. Any questions?
No questions.
No questions?
No.
Questions or questions? Okay.
No question.
Okay, go ahead. Oh, sorry. Did you say no question or did you say you had a question?
I think she said no question.
Okay.
No question.
No question. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back. I'm going to have everybody go back to Class Kick. I put in a couple of practice inferencing questions. So they're all questions going back to inferencing, just like what we're doing here. You will have to analyze the characters. Keep this in mind. You know the way a story is supposed to go. They're not going to give you all of this. You have to just infer. Okay. So I'm going to give us about 10 minutes to do that. I want you guys to get as far as you can. You don't have to go anywhere else. It's still in Class Kick. And it starts on page, I'm going to remove this page. It's going to start on page 9. You're going to see text, going to be about a paragraph long, and it's going to ask you to infer what happened in the story and answer some questions. So we're going to come back at 11:40. We're going to go over the practice questions. Got about 3 more minutes. Okay, so let's go ahead and come back together. So we're gonna look at the very first question, and we're gonna talk about that together. I'm gonna allow you guys to help each other. So as we're working on this, it should allow you to raise your hand and get help from your friends. So let's see how well we understood inferencing. Okay, so let's come back together. Let's see how well we understood inferencing. Okay. Okay. Oh, Alma didn't actually do page 8. Okay. So I'm going to read it out loud. Everybody should be able to see it on their screens. Emilio took the cap off his head, dropped the baseball bat, rested his elbows on the fence. It wasn't that he couldn't find the ball, it was sitting right in the middle of the lawn, just beyond the fence. The fence was not very high either. Emilio could probably get a running start and grab the top of the fence and flip right over it. But there was a dog, a large Rottweiler with a spiked collar. He sat under an awning a few feet away from the ball. He looked at Emilio and let out a menacing growl. Archie, Scotty, and Dutch ran up to Emilio and surveyed the situation. Archie was the first to speak. So are you going to do it, Emilio? All right, so as I'm looking through. Okay, good. So we understood that. I'm just going through the responses here that I can see. Okay, so everybody that I can see in Class Kick did well. The only people that I cannot see in Class Kick, so I'm not sure what's going on. I haven't seen anything. And then looks like Diane is not in because I don't see hers. Okay. So it's
Mr.
pretty,
Mota,
yes.
disculpe. Lo que pasa es que no tengo el link para las preguntas, por eso le decía si me lo podía creer en YouTube para poder entrar otra vez.
Oh, ok, sí, se lo puedo
Ya
mandar
que
ahora.
realmente me salí y entonces no puedo hacer las preguntas.
Oh, ok, sí, aquí le voy a mandar un link ahora.
Ok, gracias.
Oh, de nada. Okay, you send that link out. Okay, so obviously the kids are not obviously, but we know based off the evidence given to us from the text that the kids are playing baseball. No one struggled with that. That was great. Now, when we look at the second question, it asks us how we know this, or I'm going to use the exact words from the text. So after it gives us the story, it then says, how do you know this? You're going to get questions that are very similar to this on the test or when you're writing your essay. Always use the term, or I'm sorry, always use the sentence frame according to the text. According to the text. Where is this? Everybody should have that. We're going to say according to the text. All right. And it's just like work, right? When you have protocols and like a manual and procedures, and someone's like, how come you can't do that? Well, according to company rules, we're not allowed. According to the employee handbook, same thing. According to the text. So when they're according to the text, Emilio's wearing a baseball cap. There's a ball, there's a field and a fence. I can infer he is playing baseball. Okay, and I love this. Question number 3 goes back to the way a fiction story is told. And it's asking you, how do you know this is Emilio's problem instead of Archie, Scotty's, or Dutch's, right? Well, we can infer that the ball belongs to Emilio because he's the one looking at it, right? And that kind of comes back to the climax where the main character is going to come face to face with the problem. And the problem here is man versus nature, right? Because the dog is keeping the boy away from the ball. Questions about that? Questions. No questions.
No questions.
Okay. So you guys did very well. And in fact, you guys did very well here. And they gave you less information than what you got on the practice test. So that lets me know that we're clicking. It's starting to make sense. Because here, everybody's able to answer the questions, and all they gave you was a paragraph. So when you see this on the test again, you're going to get multiple paragraphs. And it'll be multiple choice. Okay. So let's take a little bit of a challenge. Let's take on a challenge. So if you go to page 9 in Class Kick, I want everybody to work on, it's not really a number, where it says Nico. I want everybody to read that paragraph and answer the questions below. It's the first question on page 9. Starts with Nico. I'm going to give everybody about 5 minutes to do that. So we're going to come back at 9:52 or 9:52 at 11:52. So I want you to read on page 9 the very first story about Nico, and we're going to talk about that. All right, we're going to meet back in 5 minutes. Got about 3 more minutes. All right. So we'll go ahead and come back together. So I chose this paragraph because I think it was a good way to see if we can go back to our prior knowledge or our schema and infer what's going on. So Nico, Erin shot at the top of her lungs as she bounded through the meadow. Come back, Nico. She was nearly out of breath, but she kept running through the tall grass. Nico, come on, boy. It's time to go home. Erin continued shouting, her voice hoarse from shouting similar expressions all day. So, as I would be reading this, I would be taking notes. So, I would be looking at things like circling the fact that she's running through the tall grass. So, she could be chasing someone, but she's running so fast that she's out of breath, right? And saying come back. So, at this point, maybe it's a child, right? Maybe it's a person she's chasing after. Then she stumbled over the leash that she was carrying. Okay, so she has a leash. So I would infer, based off my own background knowledge, that you probably don't have a leash for a child. And what I would say about that too, because this happens a lot, is that people will say things like, oh, well, I have a crazy uncle and he likes to put his leash on kids and walk them through the mall so they don't get lost. Well, that's not typical. That's not what a reasonable person would do. That's the other thing about making inferences. You have to be reasonable. Okay. So, yes, some people do put their kids on leashes, but that's not what normally happens. That's not reasonable. We normally put leashes on things like animals. And if she's running through a grass field with a leash shouting out a name, that sounds like something you would do for a dog. That makes the most sense because people normally, a reasonable person, walks their dog. Whoa, come on, Nico, Erin shouted, regaining her balance. Right. So if she's now telling Nico to come on and she doesn't have balance, then I can really infer that it's a dog. The dog got off the leash somehow, and Aaron had to go chase the dog. Questions so far?
No question.
Okay. And as you can see, this comes and follows that same structure, right? We have the exposition. We know they're in the field. The characters are the dog and Aaron. We have the rising action. The dog gets loose. The climax, the owner has to go look for the dog, right? Man versus nature again. You have the falling action. They found the dog, the resolution. She leaves with the dog, right? What does that teach you? Be responsible, stuff like that, right? So this little paragraph still follows that same pattern, but it's up to us to fill it in. So we know that Nico is a dog. Questions about that? And I'm expecting at least one question because everybody that I looked at, not everybody said that Nico was a dog. So I'm at least expecting one person to have a question.
No, at first I thought that Nico was a horse
Oh, okay. Okay. And why did you believe that Nico was a horse?
because he was in the. When I assumed that he was running in the meadow with the grass.
Okay. Yeah. Uh-huh. And that happens. So that's why I always go with what's reasonable. Right. So in science, there's this idea called Occam's razor. Little fun fact. And Occam's razor in science means that the simplest explanation is usually the best. Right. So the simplest explanation, what a reasonable person would do in a meadow with a leash, is look for a dog. That can get harder to do when we're reading a story and we have no background knowledge, which is again what made the practice test, that question about the bird and all of that. It made it difficult to understand what was going on because maybe we don't have a lot of background knowledge on the court. And because we don't have a lot of background knowledge, it's hard for us to infer. But very good so far. Okay, so we're down to about 3 minutes. Any burning questions? Do we feel comfortable with inferencing? Because we're going to be doing inferences for everything: fiction writing, otherwise known as literature, informational text, otherwise known as nonfiction. We're going to do a lot of that. Any questions?
No
No
question.
question.
Okay, so we see
No
this.
question.
Okay,
No question.
good. So if we see this again, which we will, everybody's comfortable. If you got bits and pieces of a story, everybody's comfortable answering questions.
Yes.
One person is confident.
Yes,
Okay.
I'm comfortable.
Okay. All right. So tomorrow we're going to be moving on into math, and we're going to stick with algebra. We're going to talk about slope-intercept form and about when a slope is undefined, everything else. Based off of this practice test for today, when we jump back into reading, what would that be on Thursday? We're going to focus on character traits, which is very similar to inferencing. And I think after that, based off everything I've seen in Class Kick, I think we're good with the fiction standards. We'll have to come back to some of them, but for the most part, I think that we're fine, given the fact that the biggest issues were just inferencing and character traits. Word choice and prediction, that's going to exist in fiction and nonfiction. So by moving on to informational text or nonfiction, we should be fine because those standards exist in both. But character traits and inferencing is really different when it comes to fiction than when it's nonfiction. And that's why we've been focusing on that. So if there are no further questions, it's about to be 12 o'clock. I will see everybody tomorrow. Make sure that you fill out the attendance form online and have a great day.
Thank you. Have a great day. See you tomorrow.
Very
Thank
welcome.
you.
Very
See you
welcome. Have a
tomorrow.
great day. See you tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. Moran.
You're very welcome.
Have a good day.